Hello everyone and welcome to another video from the Tiny Menagerie. There are many small fish on the market that are perfectly suitable for smaller aquariums, but there aren't very many fish that come smaller than this. This is the extremely diminutive exclamation point Rasbora, sometimes also known as the least Rasbora or the sparrow Rasbora, and it's one of the smallest fish available in the hobby and in the whole world actually. And yet, what they lack in size, they certainly make up for in character and sheer pint-sized perfection. But what do these little fish like to keep, and what kind of setup do they need? Well, exclamation points hail from the dense swamps of Thailand through Vietnam and Cambodia, and so it's no surprise at all that they do like an aquarium that gives them plenty of optional hiding places, and in general, the more dense and lush you can make their tank, the braver they tend to be. And in particular, they seem to really appreciate the surface of the water having some form of covering, whether that's from dedicated floating plants or just a few stems. Having some protection above them means they can be more confident out in the open, knowing that they're less likely to get snatched up by a passing kingfisher. In very bare tanks, you will probably never see them, as they are very good at hiding in the darkest corners they can find or behind the heater. Whereas conversely, if they have hiding places available, then they're much more willing to be out in the open, knowing that there's somewhere nearby they can dart to if they need to. And in fact, despite their really small size, I've found mine to be incredibly brave once they're settled into a new tank. They don't appear to be concerned at all about lighting or substrate colour, they don't care how bright the tank is at all. And after a few weeks they will even become one of the species that recognises movement outside of the glass, and they'll come to the front to beg for food. But that does take a little while, and so don't be surprised if they disappear for a few days after they're put into a new tank. It can take them as long as a month in order to settle in. I suppose when you're that small you really do have to be extra cautious about everything. And these are teeny tiny little fish. The males are slightly longer than the females, but even they only max out at about 16 to 20 millimeters. And as they're also a very slender fish, they tend to appear even smaller than they are. Being so small though is a big part of their appeal. They are so perfectly formed in such a minute little package that the more you look at them, the more they draw you in. That is, of course, if you can find them. Sadly, these little fish are not readily seen in the hobby, and even my pair were a bit of a mistake as they were actually in a tank with a bunch of chili Rasboras, which are a slightly larger and slightly more common species. In fact, over the past 20 years or so in the hobby, I think I've only seen exclamation points for sale a handful of times. But that could very well be just my area, and as far as I know, they are much more common in other countries like the USA. Luckily for me though, I do have a pair, and so I am hoping I can breed them in the future, just to add to the numbers a little bit. Being tiny, you might be tempted to try keeping exclamation points in nano tanks, but they're actually a very active species, and I find that when they're in very small tanks, they tend to be very still and disinterested. Just sort of hovering and looking a bit depressed up the corners, whereas as soon as you give them a bit more space they become a lot more interested and spend much more time out in the open hunting around looking for little invertebrates to eat. And so they will need a tank that is at least 40 litres in order to keep them happy, and they're also a very sociable species, and so you should aim to keep them ideally with at least 6 members in the group. And they're also rather picky when it comes to their water parameters. Much like a lot of the other micro Rasboras, in order to really thrive long term, exclamation points need acidic water. They need a pH that is around 6, and the total dissolved solids to be somewhere between the 100 to 150 mark, and a temperature between 22 and 28, so they are a little bit on the particular side. In fact, I found they need pretty much exactly the same water conditions as you would give to Caridina shrimp. And they do make perfect tank mates for shrimp. Exclamation points are too small to harm even the tiniest of newly hatched shrimplets. In fact, I would go so far as to say I would always keep these fish with shrimp, as the two complement each other just so perfectly. The Rasbora is too small to have many other tankmates in the fish community really, apart from very small danios or some of the tiny tetras perhaps, but the vast majority of other fish will just see them as food as it's just a tiny little slither of fish. Plus, needing that very specific water parameters, they are just not ideal candidates for a community tank. And in all honesty, they can be a little bit of a pain to feed. When it comes to diet, the first obvious issue is that you're trying to find a food that's actually small enough for them to eat. Even the smallest of micro pellets are too big for them. Very finely crushed flake would be small enough, and ideal if you can get them to actually feed on it. But, and certainly with mine, I have a strong suspicion that all of the ones coming into the hobby are actually wild caught, as mine will flat refuse to eat anything that isn't wriggling. And then there's also the problem that there's not very many live foods that are easy to cultivate that are small enough neither. And so we've settled for a basic diet of microworms, the type that you usually feed to fry, which are fairly easy to cultivate. Anything else that they need to eat, they are just going to have to find from the microscopic life in their tank. And luckily though, they are absolutely avid little hunters. These fish seem to always be scouring around the plants and the substrate looking for something to eat. They will happily hunt down copepods and anything else that's small enough for them. Which is absolutely fine. But it does mean I'm now in the situation where I have a pair of minuscule fish who have an entire 60-litre tank to themselves, and they're dropping an awful lot of that food straight onto the substrate. And so, some shrimp will be added soon to mop up what's being left uneaten. Although of course there are other very small fish you could use for the same job. Pygmy cories, for example, would be fantastic to keep in this tank, as they too are very small and have absolutely no interest in hunting other fish regardless of their size. Despite all of this though, once they are settled, exclamation points are hardy. They are remarkably resilient and mine have withstood numerous power cuts and huge swims in water parameters without so much as batting an eyelid. Not that they have any, but you know what I mean. Overall though, while these certainly aren't the easiest fish to keep and they do have very particular needs, and they can be a bit of a challenge to even find in the first place, they are well worth the effort if you have the space to give them their own dedicated home. Anywho though, I hope you've enjoyed this little video all about exclamation point Rasboras. Happy fish keeping everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye!